I, George Walker Bush, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Boys ready to blow, ready for war. Niggas acting like they're ready to go, but I ain't going nowhere. I'm staying right here. Y'all better call the police to the streets. I'm gonna stand on my feet like Muhammad Ali with my fist in the air, saying power to the people. Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, come on. Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, come on. Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, come on. World don't want it, but the boys gon' bring it. It's a new world order. Let the background sing it. Yeah. Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, come on. Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, Bush boys ready to blow. Hey, I can see you and your crew, cause I see through the fact that you're high behind red, white, and blue.
Police read you your race from right to left, but I never right to remain.
Welcome to another Media is Possible. It's fall and time for our Back to School special. As students across the country head back to school with dreams of graduation and successful careers, many will be targeted by military recruiters and steered into a life in the military. Still others will be labeled with learning or behavioral disorders, transfer to alternative schools, and then find themselves on a fast track to the juvenile justice system. Stay with us as we talk with Benita Stanley of the Georgia ACLU, who is working on dismantling what she calls the school-to-prison pipeline. So, if you're a student or know one, stay with us to see if you're on track to a quality education or on the road to a place like this.
I just try to stay alive, to witness where the battle lines are drawn, to speak my mind. And
Hello everyone, this is Gary Cameron with another Media is Possible as we continue our Back to School special. Right now I have Benita Stanley with the ACLU of Georgia. She's the statewide organizer and public policy director, and she's leading the ACLU's efforts to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline here in Georgia. Glad to have you with us.
Thank you for having me. Happy to be here.
So basically tell us first of all exactly what you see is the school-to-prison pipeline.
Sure. The school-to-prison pipeline is essentially a trend that's happening across the nation where predominantly children of color are being pushed out of the public school system and into alternative schools, the juvenile justice system, and even the adult correctional system.
And what is, not the motive, but what is causing these students to get put into these special schools like this? The behavioral problems or what?
Well, it's complicated. We think that there's a couple public policies that are helping to funnel children out of public schools. One of the first problems that we're seeing is right after the Columbine massacre, which predominantly was in a suburban white area, public policies were passed around the country based on the fear that that kind of violence would happen in schools every day. And so from that were zero-tolerance policies. Zero-tolerance policies were adopted everywhere in the country and certainly in Georgia. Under zero-tolerance policies, minor typical adolescent infractions are being criminalized to the point where there actually have police officers in the schools who have handcuffs and guns and arrest children and charge them with misdemeanors and felonies, which is problematic because in Georgia at the age of 16, you could be tried as an adult for certain crimes. That's one of the public policies. That's an educational policy that's impacting, pushing children into the pipeline. The second and the biggest problem in public policy impacting the pipeline would be the No Child Left Behind Act. Under the No Child Left Behind Act, school systems and school districts must administer these high-stakes standardized tests on a very frequent basis in order to get the federal funding, and you have to, of course, pass those tests to maintain your funding. So under the No Child Left Behind Act, children who do not test well put their schools and their school districts in a very precarious position. And so it is to the school district's benefit to try to push the children out who are low performers, who don't test well, so that the school can maintain their funding. Now, alternative schools were traditionally set up for children with behavioral problems, children that have been involved in criminal activity and therefore can't function well in a traditional mainstream school environment. what's happening now is, yes, some of those children are being put there, but the majority of the children that are being placed there now are low performers. They're not children who are behaviorally challenged or disruptive or have sort of chronic bad behavior. They're children who simply don't test well. And the problem with that is, as we know through research and studies, that particularly children of color don't test well on standardized tests because they're very culturally biased. So what we're finding is there's a huge number of children of color that are being pushed into these alternative school environments instead of being provided the educational support and social support services they need to function well and to test better in their traditional mainstream school.
Now, is there any way in which the alternative schools are actually helping these students in any way improve their test scores or improve their education, or is it just a downward spiral from there into the prison system?
We have found that there is very little to almost none in terms of educational services being provided at many alternative schools around the country. And that's not all. There are some that are doing a great job. But most of the alternative schools don't really have any sort of educational services to help children earn their educational credits, transition them back to their mainstream, their regular school system, and graduate on time. And so what we're finding is that children who have been sent to an alternative school don't have the same curriculum and aren't up to par. And even if they were transferred back to their main school, they wouldn't be at an equal standing. And what happens is, if kids get into an alternative school, particularly some bad ones, they give up. And in Georgia at 16 you can check yourself out of school. And so what we found in the state of Georgia is that we are essentially creating this permanent underclass. We have this huge number of children who are just giving up.
So these alternative schools are basically one-way streets. You're not seeing students go there for a semester to improve their scores and then come back into the public schools? Is that happening at all?
That was the ideal, that was the goal, but we're not seeing that in a lot of alternative schools. And this is not only happening in Georgia, it's happening all over the country. The challenge with the No Child Left Behind Act and the zero tolerance policies is, if a school is incentivized to keep their test scores up and to push out kids, you push out the kids you consider undesirable. Unfortunately, this always tends to be children of color, mostly African American and Latino, also Native American in other parts of the country, but mostly kids who are poor and kids who basically are on the federal lunch program, kids who are poor and kids who have disabilities. So those are the kids that are the most vulnerable and the most likely to be pushed out. What happens once you get to an alternative school is that either you get frustrated because you're actually in an environment where some kids need to be there. Some kids have been in gangs, some kids have shot people, some kids have stabbed another person. And if you're just there because you don't test well, you're going to become victimized. So you need to develop this quote-unquote prison mentality. You need to toughen up to survive, or you need to get out of here because you're not going to survive. And so what we find is kids get frustrated, they're tired of getting beaten up every day, and they decide, I'm either going to drop out or I'm going to join a gang so that I can be safe every day. Now, at some point, when you reach 16 and you decide to check yourself out, if you don't have a high school diploma, you're not going to go to college, your earning potential is slim to none. So then you are walking the streets, selling drugs, gang banging, and you look up and you wind up, you're in jail. And so this is why we think this whole phenomenon of pushing out kids out of school leads to them going to prison, which is why we call it the school-to-prison pipeline.
Do you know what the percentage is of the students who are sent to these alternative schools who actually do graduate?
Those numbers aren't published.
Well, that's interesting.
And so, I mean, with the parent groups that I've established across the state, one of the things that we teach the parents to do is to write an open records request letter and submit it to their local school administration and school board to request those kinds of numbers. School districts do not have to count the kids that they push out to alternative schools or who have been sent to juvenile hall. So it automatically inflates their graduation rates. And it doesn't include the kids who dropped out. So the rates that they submit to the State Department of Education, we think are totally inaccurate, because you've missed out on this huge number of kids that you've pushed out. And so we are trying to figure out what happens to those kids and where are they counted.
So the alternative schools are funded by the state of Georgia, aren't they?
Most of the alternative schools, true, are funded by the State Department of Education, which gets funds from the Federal Department of Education. However, there are some school districts who have decided to outsource their alternative school function, and we have one of those in the city of Atlanta. The Atlanta public school system has contracted with a for-profit corporation called Community Education Partners to, in fact, run their alternative school. And if you are a for-profit corporation and you're getting paid per child per day, it is to your benefit to keep that child there as long as possible. There are some cases that families have told me that a child has been like in the 8th grade for 4 or 5 years at this particular school. And this is just one of the for-profit entities that are running some of the public alternative schools in the state. There are a number of them. And then, of course, that corporation is running many across the nation.
I was asking about that because it seems like even though the state is funding the alternative schools, they're basically invisible students. They're completely off the books now once they're out of the public schools and moved into the alternative schools. They're kind of forgotten about, and if they graduate, fine, but we're not going to keep track of how many do and how many don't.
Well, unfortunately, I have come to think of these groups of kids as the kids that no one cares about. They're kind of the throwaway population. And as an African American woman, that's very upsetting because most of these children are African American, predominantly African American boys. And we already know that of the over 2 billion people in prisons in this country.
I mean 2 million.
Excuse me.
2 million. I thought you said 2 billion. That's a little bit high. 2 million people in prisons in this country. The majority of them are African American men. And so it follows that trend. If you're going to continue to incarcerate African American men at a higher rate than the rest of the population, then pushing out these African American boys and criminalizing typical adolescent behavior and kind of leaving them on the street, they're going to wind up in that prison system. So now, what is the next step once they get into the alternative school? What's the next step from there actually being incarcerated?
They can actually be incarcerated in elementary school, in middle school, and in high school. They don't even have to get transferred to an alternative school. Under these zero tolerance policies, let's say, for example, if a child gets into a fight on campus, and that fight is considered punishable by a disciplinary panel or a tribunal panel, that child has to go before this panel of administrators in their school system to decide whether that child can be arrested and taken to jail, if that child will be kicked out of the school system for a week, or if that child will be kicked out of the school system for a year. And that's happening every day in Georgia.
Now, it seems like when I was in school back in the last century, in the 60s and 70s, if someone was in a fight or someone had some sort of, behavioral problems, it was dealt with internally with the school, with the parents. You might be suspended or expelled, but there was never any chance that you were going to jail or to prison or being arrested at the school. So this seems to be
That's exactly what used to happen. I mean, typical adolescent infractions, whether it's spitting or calling a teacher the B word or whatever, the principal, the teacher, and your parent handled it. Even if you were suspended for a couple of days, it was handled that way. Now in this hypersensitive fear environment, which I think was brought on a lot by Columbine and these zero tolerance policies that were passed, children are now being criminalized. And, we can talk about Troy Davis, we can talk about Janarlo Wilson, but there is this trend in this country where we don't value children. And we criminalize typical regular behavior that kids do every day, as opposed to giving them positive behavioral intervention and supports and, trying to support them and provide the services they need to make a better decision the next time something like that comes up.
Now, what role can the parents play if they feel their children are being railroaded out of the school for minor scuffling or mouthing off to the teacher or something like that, and they don't feel their child really has behavioral problems or is a discipline problem, and they don't want them going into the alternative school. Could the parents intervene in some way? And
well, yes and no. Once a child is already involved in some sort of behavior that the school system says is inappropriate, that child has already entered the pipeline per se, and it's very hard to stop. It's incredibly hard to stop for poor parents of color. It's easier to stop for more affluential and sometimes white families because they can get an attorney. One of the challenges that parents face is many parents aren't even notified when their child is going to go before a tribunal or a disciplinary panel. Schools are required to give parents notice.
I would think so.
What happens is in some school districts, in a particular school district in North Georgia, you're supposed to give a parent 10-day notice. Parents usually get notice about 2 days before. So in that 10 days, you're supposed to talk to your child, talk to the other students who saw the fight or the incident, get witness statements, collect information, figure out how to best present your case, bring in a character reference, maybe have the pastor of your church write a character letter, come with you to the tribunal panel. And then all those people can weigh in and say, this is what we saw, this is what we know of this child deserves another chance. If you're giving that information 2 days before on a Friday and the tribunal is a Monday morning, one, maybe you can't take off work and be there with your child. And two, you certainly don't have all that time to collect the information I suggested that should be collected. So often, poor children of color and their parents walk into a disciplinary panel. Children often walk in alone, but if they have their parents, they're completely at a disadvantage. They're completely at a disadvantage. You sometimes have the school's police officer, which is called a school resource officer, a principal, another administrator, some sort of director of discipline, maybe the teacher involved. And they're all there, and they're all saying what a horrible thing your child has done and should be kicked out of our school. And oftentimes that child is sitting there alone with all of these adults. And it's difficult. And
with no one defending them at all.
Right, and the children usually get the short end of the stick. Now, if you're of a more affluent financial background and in a better suburban community, the notices go out sometimes better to parents, but not always. They don't go out as well to parents who have disabled children because they're not valued again. And so it just kind of depends on where you sit. But on an optimistic side, I have been asked to travel the state of Georgia to talk to parents about the pipeline, basically to do public education and to build awareness. And one of the things that I've been doing over the past 2 years is going into people's homes, community centers, PTA meetings, school board meetings, and introducing myself to parents and saying, this is what the pipeline is, this is what we can do to help your child stay out of the pipeline in Georgia. And I try to get 3 to 5 parents in each community who are interested, and then we convene a meeting. And then we say, okay, let's pull the data for your county, for your school district on the number of suspensions, expulsions, the dropout rate, transfers to alternative schools. And we pull the data, and no matter what community I've been in Georgia and other parts of the country, parents are stunned that all the children being pushed out are poor, disabled, and children of color. And so from there, parents decide they're going to take action. And from that, I have developed what I call my parent-led coalitions to dismantle the school-to-prison pipeline. And I have 16 of those coalitions around the state. And those coalitions have had varying levels of success in their particular communities. I have coalitions from Dahlonega down to Valdosta, Georgia, from Albany over to Augusta to Athens to Rome to Columbus, all over the state. So these parents are really deciding. They look at the data and they say, okay, this is happening in our community. What can we do about it? We can ask the school system to be more forthwith in terms of their data collection and their data sharing. We can ask the school to explain to us why 68% of your suspensions are African American boys when they only represent 32% of our community. Why are you disproportionately disciplining African American boys more harshly than others? And these are parents who are taxpayers, who basically these school board administrators and these school board members work for them, so they have to be accountable to these parents. There's been school districts where one of the parents from a coalition decided they were going to run for a school board seat because they felt like no one on the school board was representing the best interests of their children. There's a coalition that has gotten their school district's student handbook and disciplinary code revised so that it's no longer disproportionately sentencing or suspending, expelling, dropping out other kids of color more than other kids. Now, it may take a couple years to see the data collection and see what it reveals, but they've had some significant successes. And so parents being informed and advocating for their children and then working with other parents who want to impact long-term change on their school system has been incredibly effective. And I'm really happy that the parents have stepped up and decided to take on this fight.
Well, that's great that the parents are doing this and confronting the school boards on the smaller local level, but looking statewide, is there anything the ACLU is doing or any legislation they'd want to see passed or anything, legally wise, that, as far as changing laws that would help dismantle this a lot faster and end up with a more equitable school system? Well,
let me start off by saying we do have current litigation against the Atlanta public school system and how they have subcontracted out their alternative school function to community education partners. And I'll refer you to my legal director if you want specifics about the status of that lawsuit. One of the things that we're hoping to do with this litigation is, as the American Civil Liberties Union of Georgia, we only take on cases that are basically impact litigation that will change kind of the standard not only in that city or in that county, but in the state and in the nation. And so that's one of the reasons why we're trying to get at this privatization of the alternative school function. That's the long-term kind of statewide thing we want to do. We don't want that to happen anymore. We think privatization of the alternative school function is ultimately a misuse of taxpayers' dollars and criminalizes children. In terms of other things at the state legislature, there are a number of proposals that a number of progressive people have introduced based on the state Senate and the state House of Reps side. But as you know, the Georgia state legislature is heavily conservative, and the progressives really don't have the number of votes to get anything passed on the Senate or the House side, which requires a 2/3 majority on each side before it goes to the governor's desk. And so it is going to be a struggle, which is why we encourage our parents and our membership across the state to really vote and to really know who your candidates are and pick the ones that are going to help shape public policy that's going to benefit you and your children and your school system. Okay. Which leads me to my last question before we wrap this up is another aspect of what you're working on is restoring felon voting rights. And we have an election coming up in a few more weeks in November. Briefly, can you tell our viewers what Georgia law states about felons and their ability to vote once they've been released and are no longer incarcerated? Sure, I love talking about this. Okay, the state of Georgia currently has about almost 300,000 people who have past felony convictions who can't vote right now. In the nation, we have 5.3 million people with past felony convictions. That is a huge number of Americans who are not participating fully in the democracy. In order for a democracy to be a democracy, you have to include everybody. You can't intentionally exclude a large number of people. Right now, the state of Georgia law says that if you are incarcerated, on parole, on probation, or have not paid all your fines, fees, and restitution, if your felony involved a crime of moral turpitude, you cannot vote. So on the alternate side, it means if you are out of prison... Forever? No. Oh. It means if you are out of prison, if you are off parole, off probation, have paid all your fines and fees and restitution, you can vote in the state of Georgia. Okay. Now, the challenge here is that Georgia has not defined what felonies involve moral turpitude. So we feel that the past Secretary of State's office was treating all felony convictions as crimes of moral turpitude.
Gotcha.
And we feel that they were intentionally disfranchising all people with past felony convictions from voting. We have asked the state of Georgia to give us a list of crimes that involve moral turpitude. We have not gotten that list. That is a project that we are working on with the National ACLU's Voting Rights Project, which is housed here in Atlanta, to ask the state to give us a list of crimes involving moral turpitude. Now, so essentially anyone who's off parole, off probation, have paid all their fines, fees, and restitution can simply go to any post office, any government building, any library, get a voter registration application and complete it. Submit it to the Secretary of State's office, and you will get your voter registration card back in the mail. Now, for the November 6th presidential election that's coming up, the deadline to register the vote just passed, which was October 6th. So we have been working very kind of fast and furiously over the past few months to get as many formerly incarcerated ex-felons to register to vote. Let me tell you what the challenge is with Georgia's felon disenfranchisement policies. If you cannot afford to pay your fines, fees, and restitution, you cannot vote in Georgia. If I am a 16-year-old African-American male who stole a $70,000 Cadillac Escalade car, right? I am convicted, I have a felony conviction, I go to prison, I do 10 years, I do 2 years on parole or probation, I'm done, but I still owe, let's just say, $50,000 in restitution. So now I'm a 27-year-old African-American man without a high school diploma, with a felony conviction. I may never be able to earn enough money to pay $50,000 off in fines, fees, and restitution, which means I'm barred from voting probably my entire life in the state of Georgia.
Yeah.
That is one of the claims we're making under litigation against the state of Georgia. And again, our National Voting Rights Project is looking for plaintiffs to join us in this possible litigation against the state of Georgia, because we see the payment of restitution in this case is basically a poll tax, which is unconstitutional.
Ah, gotcha. Okay. Well, we've been talking with Benita Stanley of the ACLU of Georgia, who is coordinating the dismantling of the school-to-prison pipeline here in Georgia, and hopefully this will catch on around the nation. Thanks for talking with us.
You better get with the door, stand to the side, just stand to the side, stand to the side. You better get with the door, stand to the side, stand to the side, stand to the side. You better get with the door, stand to the side. Come on.